Mary Vincent was born in 1963 and grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, USA. She was the middle child among 7 siblings in a household with limited resources. Some reports indicate that her father served in the military and later worked as a mechanic, while her mother was known to have made a living as a blackjack dealer at one of the city's famed casinos. Despite living in a place synonymous with excess and freedom, which critics often equate with moral decline, Mary's parents were strict and conservative. Her father had a reputation for being bad-tempered, and the tense relationship between her parents created a strained family dynamic. Despite these challenges, Mary was a cheerful child with a passion for dance. From a young age, she showed exceptional talent, and her teachers believed that if she continued to train with the same dedication she had shown in her early years, she could one day perform on prestigious stages, a dream that fueled her desire to escape her oppressive home life. In addition to her artistic pursuits, she was a good student, but everything began to change during her teenage years. As she entered adolescence, Mary faced not only the typical hormonal changes and natural rebelliousness of that age, but also increasing turmoil at home. Her parents were in the midst of a contentious divorce, which only heightened the tensions within the family. The more strained the household became, the more defiant Mary grew. She began to push back against her parents' strict rules, wearing makeup, dating older boys, breaking curfews, and frequently skipping classes. One fateful day, one of Mary's sisters warned her that their father, already in a foul mood due to a severe migraine, was on his way home and was particularly angry with Mary. Fearing her father's wrath, the young girl fled in haste, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of her home. At just 15 years old, Mary ran away and stayed with her boyfriend, whose identity has remained undisclosed. The young couple journeyed from Las Vegas to Sausalito, on the outskirts of San Francisco, where they briefly lived together. During that summer, Mary lived in her boyfriend's car, but their adventure came to an abrupt end one morning. A police officer approached the vehicle where they were sleeping and asked for their identification. Upon discovering that the young man was an adult while Mary was still a minor, the police arrested her boyfriend, charging him with statutory rape, a crime that occurs when an adult engages in intimate relations with an underage individual, even if consensual, as it's seen as taking advantage of the age disparity. With her boyfriend detained and the car confiscated, Mary found herself utterly alone in an unfamiliar city, without any support or financial resources. Left with no other option, she decided to return home. In 1978, hitchhiking, also known as thumbing a ride, was a common practice. Many people didn't own cars, and public transportation was scarce. According to Mary, hitchhiking was so routine for her that she once again ran away from home, heading south to briefly stay with an uncle in Singleton, California. However, she didn't feel comfortable there either. During those harsh days, she resorted to sleeping in unlocked cars, scavenging for food in dumpsters, and surviving on the goodwill of strangers, all while dreaming of a better future. Tired of her nomadic life filled with hardship, Mary decided it was time to pursue her dream of becoming a dancer. With that goal in mind, she set out to cover the 620 kilometers to her grandfather's house in Corona, California, a city on the outskirts of Los Angeles. She longed to be in a place where she felt at home, with a beloved relative. Despite her rebellious streak, Mary still retained a childlike innocence, chasing her dreams without fully grasping the dangers of her actions. Her grandfather's home had the added advantage of being close to Hollywood, where she envisioned herself becoming part of the entertainment world. Given that she had hitchhiked long distances in the past without incident, the teenager decided to use the same strategy, as she had no reason to believe this time would be any different. On September 28th, Mary packed her belongings into a backpack and began her journey to her grandfather's house. Young and attractive, she had no trouble finding drivers willing to give her a ride. However, the downside of hitchhiking was that most people would only take her a few kilometers, forcing her to start the process all over again. When she arrived in Modesto, Mary joined 2 other hitchhiking girls who had positioned themselves near a busy street. Being in a group made everything feel more organized. They even carried signs indicating that they were heading to Southern California, hoping this would attract a good Samaritan to take them at least part of the way. The signs were meant to signal that only drivers heading south should offer them a ride. Unfortunately, their hope for a safe ride was short-lived. Before long, a blue van driven by a middle-aged man pulled up. After pulling up next to the 3 girls, The driver of the van glanced at the trio and gestured for Mary to get in, telling her he could take her all the way to Los Angeles. Although it wasn't her final destination, the distance he offered to cover was significant, leaving her, by her own estimation, just 45 minutes away from her grandfather's house. When all three girls tried to get into the van, the man insisted there was only room for one passenger. The two hitchhikers who had joined Mary exchanged puzzled glances. They had taken a quick look inside and felt there was more than enough space for all of them. Concerned by this detail, the two girls Mary had just met warned her not to get in, suggesting that something felt off about the man and his insistence on taking only her. Fearing for her safety, they advised her to wait for another, more trustworthy ride. However, Mary, exhausted from days spent standing under the scorching sun hitchhiking, only to be dropped off after short rides, forcing her to get in and out of cars countless times, decided to ignore their warnings. Hoping for a long ride this time, she climbed into the front passenger seat. The driver, though somewhat rough around the edges, initially came across as friendly and talkative. The first few miles passed without incident. Everything seemed fine until the man lit a cigarette, causing Mary to sneeze. Concerned, he asked if she was sick, then unexpectedly reached over to touch her neck, claiming he was checking her temperature. The physical contact felt inappropriate, setting off alarm bells in Mary's mind. She quickly recoiled, moving out of his reach. But then she second-guessed herself, convincing herself that maybe he was just being kind. Determined to dismiss her fears, she tried to relax. They even made a brief stop along the way, with nothing suspicious happening, which helped her let her guard down. Exhausted from the past few days, she eventually fell asleep. When she woke up, her fears were confirmed. The driver had taken a detour from the planned route. Showing the same determination that had gotten her this far, Mary grabbed a sharp stick she found in the vehicle and pointed it at him, demanding he turn back and get back on the original route. Startled by her reaction, the man quickly apologized, assuring her that he was just an honest man who had made a mistake. Despite his reassuring words, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Regretful, the driver resumed their journey. At one point, he pulled over in a secluded area, claiming he had an urgent need to relieve himself and couldn't wait for the next rest stop. Mary seized the opportunity to get out and stretch her legs. Always cautious, she thought it best to tighten her shoelaces in case something went wrong and she needed to run. As she bent down to tie her shoes securely, the man she was traveling with struck her in the back of the head with a hammer. Mary collapsed instantly, and as she lay on the ground, he delivered another blow, knocking her unconscious. He then dragged her limp body into the back of the van and drove off to a desolate area known as Del Puerto Canyon, not far from Interstate 5, where they had initially been traveling. Hours later, when Mary regained consciousness, she found herself in a nightmarish situation beyond anything she could have imagined. The driver had tightly bound her in the back of the van, each of her arms stretched against opposite walls, rendering her completely immobile. No matter how much she struggled or scanned her surroundings, there was no chance of escape. As Mary slowly came to, she also realized that she was naked. The man threatened her, saying he would kill her if she screamed, and told her that if she wanted to live, she would have to obey him completely. He forced her to drink spiked liquor from a bottle, keeping her subdued for hours. Throughout the long, terrifying night, he repeatedly assaulted and violated her, forcing her to comply with his sick demands, all the while instructing her to be a good girl. What made the ordeal even more chilling was that this depraved attacker had a daughter the same age as Mary, which only deepened the horror of his actions, given that he was a father himself. When the sun rose the next day, Mary pleaded with him to let her go, promising not to report him to the police. But the man had a far more sinister plan. He reached for his toolbox and pulled out a hatchet. Mockingly, he asked Mary if she wanted to be free, and when she said yes, he swung the weapon at her left arm. Desperate to hold on, Mary grabbed onto her attacker, but it was no use. She felt herself falling. Looking down, she saw that her left arm was completely severed, and an unbearable pain shot through her. The man then turned his rage on her right arm, hacking at it near the elbow. Despite the excruciating pain, Mary remained conscious, kicking and screaming for help, hoping someone, anyone, might hear her cries. But they were in the middle of nowhere, and all her desperate pleas for help went unheard. The struggle was fierce. and the man found it much harder to sever her right arm due to her resistance, making the ordeal agonizingly prolonged and painful. The attacker finally achieved his gruesome goal. As he stood over Mary, he mockingly told her that he had freed her, just as she had wished. Overwhelmed by pain, Mary felt on the verge of fainting, but her body, in its instinct to survive, flooded her system with adrenaline. Despite the odds stacked against her, all Mary could think about was staying alive. Without her two upper limbs, naked, and in a state of shock, she was thrown by her assailant off a cliff. She tumbled down a 30-foot 9-meter drop, rolling over rocks before landing near some concrete pipes. From above, the man yelled down at her, taunting that she was now truly free. He then fled the scene, convinced that he had ended her life and that no one would ever find her. But he was gravely mistaken. At the bottom of the ravine, Mary was in excruciating pain. She could see exposed muscles dangling from what remained of her right arm, and blood was pouring profusely from both of her stumps. Weak and on the brink of collapse, she felt a strong urge to sleep, but she knew that if she gave in, her story would never be told. Summoning every ounce of her indomitable spirit, Mary resolved to fight for her life. With no arms, no clothes, and barely any strength, she faced the seemingly impossible task of scaling the cliffside to reach the road above. But first, she noticed a small pit of mud nearby. In a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, she plunged her wounded arms into the mud, hoping that it would dry and form a sort of seal to slow the hemorrhaging. The pain was excruciating, but Mary pressed on, using only her legs, the powerful legs of a dancer, to climb the rugged cliff. She endured agony with every move, relying solely on her lower body strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached a dirt road, her spirit lifting slightly. But her ordeal was far from over. Mary found herself in a remote area and had to stagger forward, weak and dizzy, trying to keep her severed arms elevated to prevent further blood loss. She walked what felt like an endless stretch before reaching the highway. Desperate, she tried to flag down the first car she saw, which had two men inside. However, her horrific appearance was so shocking that the men panicked and sped away, too frightened to help her. When the first car saw Mary, instead of stopping to help, the driver accelerated and sped away. According to her later recounting, Mary feared that no one would assist her due to her ghastly appearance, thinking she looked more like a ghost than a person. However, her luck changed when a second car passed by. This time, a compassionate couple inside couldn't ignore her dire condition. They immediately pulled over, rushed to her aid, and drove her straight to the hospital. At the hospital, the couple told the police they had found Mary on a dimly lit back road, where only the headlights of passing cars pierced the darkness, and she had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. The young girl underwent extensive emergency surgery to save her life. To reconstruct part of her right arm, surgeons had to graft muscle from one of her legs. But while this procedure was crucial for providing her with a somewhat functional stump where a prosthetic could later be attached, it came at a painful cost. The muscle transfer made it impossible for Mary to ever regain the stability in her legs necessary for dancing, thus shattering her dream of performing on grand stages. When Mary woke up after the surgery, the doctors informed her that she would need to use prosthetics for her arms for the rest of her life. Faced with this devastating news, and still in shock from the harrowing ordeal she had endured, Mary once again showed remarkable courage. Instead of collapsing into despair, she asked the police to let her assist in creating an identikit to capture her assailant. Thanks to the artist's skill and Mary's detailed description, the authorities were able to identify the suspect quickly. From the moment of the brutal attack, Mary proved to be unlike any other victim. She refused to be confined to a hospital bed, unwilling to let her trauma define her. She was determined not only to recover but also to ensure her attacker was brought to justice. After 2 weeks of hospitalization, Mary began using arm prosthetics, a challenging adjustment that would take years to master, requiring countless hours of physical therapy. She also underwent intensive psychotherapy to help her process the severe trauma she had suffered. Within those same 2 weeks, police efforts to locate the perpetrator intensified. They released a composite sketch to the media, which soon led to a breakthrough. A neighbor recognized the suspect from the sketch and contacted the police with information on his whereabouts. The dangerous man was soon identified as Lawrence Bernard Singleton. Lawrence Singleton was born in Tampa, Florida, on July 28, 1927. Little is known about his early life, and were it not for the heinous crimes he committed against Mary, he might have continued living in near-total anonymity. Singleton was a merchant seaman by trade. A People magazine article later described him as a heavy drinker and a mean-spirited drunk. By the time he met Mary in 1978, he had already endured 2 failed marriages and had a strained relationship with his teenage daughter. Upon his arrest, Singleton insisted that Mary was a sex worker he had hired for $100 and denied any wrongdoing. He even claimed that another person had been in the car and that Mary had threatened him with false accusations. However, these desperate lies fell apart under scrutiny. Later, Florida's Assistant Attorney General, Scott Brown, described Lawrence Singleton as a man filled with hatred and a deep-seated aversion to women. Lawrence Bernard Singleton was known to harbor deep-seated hatred towards women, and according to Assistant Attorney General Scott Brown, this animosity seemed to reach a boiling point when he attacked Mary at the age of 50. Though Mary was his first known victim, authorities did not rule out the possibility that he had assaulted other women in the past. When Mary received the news of her attacker's arrest, she felt a sense of relief, but it was not as comforting as she had hoped. The trauma of her ordeal, compounded by the challenges of using prosthetics, left her struggling with depression. Yet her rebellious spirit once again became her greatest ally. Displaying remarkable ingenuity and resolve, Mary overcame several obstacles, the most pressing of which was her inability to afford high-quality prosthetics. With sheer creativity, she salvaged parts from an old refrigerator and music equipment to modify and personalize her artificial arms, adapting them to her needs. Later on, she even contributed to designing special prosthetic arms that allowed her to play bowling, showcasing her resourcefulness and resilience. Just months after the horrific attack, despite her severe injuries and the psychological scars she carried, Mary courageously agreed to testify against her attacker. Even though the thought of facing him again terrified her, she bravely attended Lawrence Singleton's trial in 1979. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence against him, leading to charges of kidnapping, attempted murder, and rape. During one chilling moment in the courtroom, Singleton managed to get alarmingly close to Mary, whispering a threat that he would finish what he started, even if it took him a lifetime. The menacing words shook Mary to her core, causing her to turn pale and flee the courtroom in panic. But her fear did not deter her resolve. She wiped away her tears, battled her anxieties, and delivered a detailed testimony of the horrors she had endured. In a later interview, Mary poignantly summarized the damage inflicted on her by Singleton, but even her powerful testimony could not secure the justice she deserved. The court's verdict left many outraged. Lawrence Singleton was sentenced to a mere 14 years in prison, a shockingly lenient punishment given the severity of his crimes. Singleton, ever the manipulative figure, maintained that he was the true victim in the events of 1978. In an astonishing twist, he filed a countersuit against Mary, claiming she had threatened him with false accusations of statutory rape and had even wielded a stick against him, forcing him to act in self-defense. His lawsuit absurdly included accusations that Mary had attempted to kidnap him with the intent to rob him. In his defense, he painted himself as a misunderstood man who had only resorted to violence because he felt threatened. Astonishingly, he even expressed what he claimed was pity for Mary. Mary's recovery journey after the brutal attack was not easy. She had to learn to live with her prosthetic arms, which required constant training. Little by little, she learned to use them for everyday tasks like cooking and even started giving talks about her life experience. However, the emotional and physical challenges persisted, and on top of that, she had to face the difficulty of supporting herself financially. In the following years, she realized that finding a job in her condition was a huge obstacle. Years later, in an interview, Mary admitted that she could barely smile during the years following the tragedy. Yet, she decided to take a positive turn in her life and dedicate herself to art. Surprisingly, she developed a talent for drawing and sculpture. Despite all her limitations, she made the conscious decision that she would never again be a victim but a survivor. She also decided to enroll in the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. Mary's love life was also difficult after the trauma she had endured. With all the emotional and physical scars she carried, she faced numerous challenges in her personal relationships. She often felt unable to trust others, fearing that her past would scare potential partners away. Over time, she did meet someone who offered her a glimmer of hope and support, but it wasn't an easy path. Her deep emotional wounds and her reluctance to open up made relationships complicated and short-lived. Lawrence's attempt to sue Mary had devastated her. She recalled that the news of the counterclaim made her vomit 3 times, and she couldn't sleep for several nights. Fortunately, the court dismissed his request as unfounded. On her part, Mary filed a civil suit against her attacker and won, with a judgment awarding her $2.5 million. However, the judgment was symbolic, as Lawrence, unemployed and without assets, never paid a single penny. During these turbulent years, Mary felt that her parents and siblings treated her as if she had died. This symbolic mourning left her feeling incomplete and even more isolated. The lack of emotional support from her family only worsened her sense of abandonment, plunging her into deeper sadness. Despite these setbacks, Mary graduated from her specialized school, a remarkable achievement that proved her unwavering determination. Fearing that Lawrence might one day be released and find her, Mary moved to another city and adopted an extremely reserved lifestyle. The effects of post-traumatic stress soon became apparent. She suffered from an eating disorder, had constant fear of leaving her house, and her social circle dwindled to almost nothing. There were dark moments when Mary even considered ending her life, but she found an inner strength that kept her going. Physical rehabilitation was a monumental challenge. She had to learn to use her prosthetic arms for daily activities, including cooking, and eventually became a public speaker, sharing her story to inspire others. Although emotional ups and downs persisted, Mary decided not to let her suffering define her. With a resilient spirit, she turned to art, discovering a passion for drawing and sculpture, which allowed her to channel her pain into something creative. Later on, she decided to take control of her life by enrolling at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, proving that despite the hardships, her spirit of perseverance remained intact. She found in art a way to heal and redefine her identity. Mary was no longer a victim, but a survivor who had learned to transform her pain into strength. At the age of 23, in 1900, she had her first child, whom she named Luke, the father of whom she never wanted to speak of. 2 years later, she thought she had found true love with a landscaper. Trusting that everything would be fine, she took a big step and decided to marry him. Just when life seemed to be falling into place for her, she received a devastating blow. On the very day of her wedding, she found out that Lawrence had been released on parole due to good behavior in prison after serving only 8 years of his sentence. The man was now free to walk the streets. This news left her stunned, and to make matters worse, her new husband seemed just as fearful as she was. Although Mary didn't expect such a strong reaction, she was surprised by the support her case received from the public. The residents of her town were outraged by the release of her attacker. The community made its stance clear, and in fact, about 500 residents gathered around the Corona Hotel, where the police had temporarily housed the recently freed criminal. The pressure was so intense that the authorities had to move Lawrence under heavy police protection, wearing a bulletproof vest, to an apartment in another city. However, he was not accepted there either. Everywhere he was taken, the public expressed their discontent, demanding his removal, labeling him a threat and a monstrous criminal. They also criticized how lenient the justice system had been in response to Lawrence's terrible crimes. The uproar worked, and the public's demands, supported by Mary, led to a change in the legislation to prevent the early release of criminals who had committed heinous acts of suffering, torment, or torture on their victims. After being moved several times due to protests, Governor George Deukmejian was forced to order Lawrence to be placed in a guarded trailer outside San Quentin prison. Around the same time, the man joined Alcoholics Anonymous, claiming he was sober. Meanwhile, Mary continued to hide and, as if life were compensating her with some joy, she received the good news that she was pregnant. Months later, she gave birth to a baby boy, whom she and her landscaper husband named Alan. He seemed as excited as she was about the baby. But one day he left without a word, and Mary was left alone with her 2 young children, the limitations of her prosthetic arms, and no job. She had to take on the care of her children under extremely difficult circumstances. A monster set free. 9 years after the attack in 1987, the Singleton law was passed in California. This law was aimed at ensuring that criminals like Lawrence, who inflicted tremendous suffering on their victims, would never again receive parole benefits. However, the law was not retroactive, so it could not be applied to Lawrence, even though it was drafted based on his case. As a result, the dangerous man was released in 1988 after serving his 1-year probation and became a free man. While living in society, upon learning about Lawrence's release, Mary was terrified. She had not forgotten his threats to come after her and take revenge once he was free. She fell into a state of constant anxiety, and as a result of all the stress, she developed anorexia nervosa. In these conditions, which were far from ideal, she struggled to raise her 2 children. Everyone was suffering because she wasn't in a condition to give them what they needed. Fortunately, a few years later, she met Tom Wilson, a man she could trust. Tom was older, had been in a relationship but was now separated, and worked in the district attorney's office. Mary remembered that on their first date, he took her to a nice restaurant and to see a show. After receiving such considerate treatment, she realized that he was the person she had always been looking for. Tom became a great support for both her and her children. He encouraged her to be herself, bought her pencils, and encouraged her to draw. He also suggested that she consider giving motivational talks, as it would inspire others and, at the same time, serve as an outlet for her suffering. They got married, and since Mary couldn't wear a wedding ring, her husband, who always paid attention to the details, bought her a silver chain with a large diamond to wear around her neck. For the first time in her life, Mary felt safe and happy. Together, they created a foundation named after her, with the goal of helping other victims of traumatic crimes by offering support and contributing to medical expenses. Mary wanted to provide support to others who had experienced similar things to her, knowing from her own experience how important it is to have a support team to help transition from being a victim to becoming a survivor, a role that enables one to face any difficulty. A chameleon blends into society. While Mary was rebuilding her life, Lawrence was determined to do the same and return to Tampa, Florida, his hometown. Despite having spent 8 years behind bars with presumed good behavior and a year of problem-free probation, he was still the same. Everything was part of a plan to gain credibility, a man who always calculated his moves and had never truly rehabilitated. In 1990, he was causing trouble again. Lawrence was convicted of theft twice, and on one occasion he was sent to prison for 60 days for stealing a disposable camera that, at the time, cost a few dollars. The other item he stole was a $3 hat. When it was time for him to be presented before the judge for these crimes, Lawrence once again demonstrated that he didn't take responsibility for his actions. He portrayed himself as a victim and claimed to be a confused old man, not a petty thief. The truth was that he knew how to manipulate, and he used all his resources to achieve his goals. One of those who fell into his trap was Tom Bennett, one of Lawrence's new neighbors in Tampa. Tom admitted he knew about Lawrence's past and initially feared him. But seeing that Lawrence always acted friendly and polite, he lowered his guard. With his plan to gain acceptance in society, the former convict even brought food he had prepared himself to his neighbors. In those terms, the locals considered him a rehabilitated man. Another resident, who was unaware of Lawrence's criminal past, allowed his granddaughter to play in the yard with Lawrence's Rottweiler. However, the charade didn't last long, and his mental deterioration began to show. He was found unconscious in his car. Neighbors called emergency services, and when paramedics arrived, they confirmed he had inhaled carbon monoxide. He had even left a note in his house stating that he intended to take his own life. In the note, he said he hoped to find peace and thanked all the people who had helped him. He also requested that, if he died, his ashes be scattered in the Palm River. Thanks to the intervention of his neighbors, Lawrence was admitted to a psychiatric hospital for a few days. Shortly after, he was sent back home, and the worst of his personality quickly resurfaced, shocking those who had believed in him and didn't consider him a danger. Returning to old habits, on February 19, 1997, Lawrence hired the services of Roxanne Hay, a 31-year-old sex worker who practiced the world's oldest profession to support her 3 young children. After paying her the agreed amount, he took her to his home in the suburb of South Springs, and once there, he attacked her with a sharp object. A construction painter who was passing by Lawrence's house heard screams coming from inside and approached the window to look. The scene he witnessed shocked him. In the living room, he saw a naked man standing over a woman whose body was bleeding heavily. Despite how badly the victim appeared, the man was mercilessly pressing on her neck. Terrified, the painter didn't dare intervene, as it was clear that the aggressor was out of control. Fearing the worst, he got into his car to find a phone and call 911. According to the description he provided to the operator and the police officers who arrived shortly after, the victim was huddled on a couch, almost too weak to defend herself, while the man was on top of her. What seemed most chilling and hard to erase from his mind were the sounds he heard coming from inside. He heard, during the attack, what he described as the sound of chicken bones breaking. The officers arrived quickly at Lawrence's house and were shocked when he himself opened the door. He was covered in bloodstains, and the absurd excuse he gave was that he had suffered an accident while cutting vegetables. Obviously, the officers didn't believe him and entered the house immediately. On the couch, they found the lifeless body of Roxanne. At first glance, they saw more than 10 stab wounds in her chest and abdomen, and there was also a deep wound on her face. Horrified by the scene, the officers estimated that the woman had tried desperately to defend herself from the attack. Evidence of her struggle was found in the form of missing phalanges from several of her fingers, indicating that she had tried to disarm the man with the knife he used to assault her. When questioned about the motive for such a brutal attack, Lawrence claimed that it was Roxanne who had threatened to cut off his head. According to his account, he was forced to fight for his life, and in the heat of the struggle, the woman came out worse for it. To make his story even more chilling, he told the investigators something that left them speechless. He claimed that before she took her last breath, the woman asked him to hug her, and he did, until Roxanne stopped breathing. After committing such a horrific assault, it was clear that Lawrence would face a new trial. As soon as the news spread, Mary knew she would have the chance to testify against him once again. While she wished for him to be locked up forever, she also understood that if a new trial had been initiated against her attacker, it was because there was another victim who had fallen into his clutches. Aware that she would be the voice of this woman, who had been silenced forever by the same man, Mary wanted to make the world aware of the evil that Lawrence held in his heart, the immense damage he had caused her, and her tireless fight to become a survivor and achieve justice. When the time for the trial came, Mary traveled from California to Florida with the sole intention of testifying against Lawrence and preventing him from enjoying freedom again. When granted the right to speak in court, the woman described to the jury the physical and emotional consequences of the kidnapping and the assaults she had suffered. She showed the mutilations inflicted by the cruel man and revealed every detail of the sordid attack. Her testimony was essential for the moment when he was declared guilty and sentenced to the punishment he deserved. She later recounted in the trial that she always regretted not being able to look him in the eyes when he was beside her. Fortunately, since there was no physical proximity, he could not whisper threats to her as he had done the first time. Lawrence was found guilty of murder and sentenced to the death penalty. When the judge delivered the sentence, Mary finally felt completely free. Justice had been served, and her attacker, a dangerous man to society, would no longer pose a risk. Lawrence spent several years on death row, alongside other inmates who were awaiting lethal injection. However, by the irony of fate, the abominable man did not live to see his sentence carried out. He died of cancer at 74 years old in the prison hospital. Ironically, his death occurred on December 28, 2001, the Day of the Innocents. According to various reports, the marriage between Tom and Mary ended, but their relationship remained one of cooperation and respect. Despite the divorce, Tom's mother, Pat Platt, was always available to her daughter-in-law and acted as a sort of second mother to Mary. In a 2003 interview with Intelligencer, Mary stated that she was proud of her metal hands and showed everything she could do with them in her kitchen. The article described the atmosphere in Mary Vincent's home, noting that while the 40-year-old woman spoke with the journalist, 2 dogs ran around her. But the most striking detail wasn't the dogs, but the sudden appearance of the family parrot, which perched on Mary's shoulder. She immediately stroked the bird's plumed chest with the metal finger of her prosthetic. At that moment, her son Lucas, who was watching the scene, told the reporters that she was spoiling the parrot and revealed that the bird had a terrible temperament and liked to peck. Mary's response was humorous, as she claimed that this was exactly why she adored the bird, since it had such an untamed nature. That moment not only gave meaning to the interview the media was conducting that day, but also to Mary's story. Her legacy is her battle, overcoming both physical and emotional pain, abandoning the role of victim, and becoming a survivor with the most diverse projects. As she put it, that is her recipe for stripping the violent of their power and continuing to live. In 2023, at 60 years old, Mary made peace with the fact that she would never be able to embrace or hold her two sons, Luke and Alan, now 37 and 35 years old. Reflecting on the events, Mary said that her life had been so profoundly affected after the attack, during which she had to move several times over the next 15 years. According to her own words in an interview she gave, with each move, she always left something behind, which only increased her sense of loss along the torturous journey. Mary has had to face financial difficulties and, at times, relied on social assistance. It was harder for her to find a job or any activity that could provide her with economic stability due to the aftermath of the assault committed by Lawrence. Despite the many challenges, and even though at times she had little attachment to life because of how hard it seemed, she found new motivation in the birth of her children, a new impulse to keep moving forward and not be defeated. As she said in an interview years ago, love has a miraculous power. She embraces Luke and Alan in a way that is different through the warmth of her gaze and with her unshakable spirit. Mary and her children have built, above the pain and evil, the happiest ending possible. Well, dear audience, this concludes another investigation. What do you think of today's case? We would love to read your comments, as your opinion about the cases is very important to us. Remember to always do so with the utmost respect for the victim and others watching, as we will be reading them. Before you leave, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you next time with another criminal investigation. Goodbye. Bye!